Jacob Mueller found her dying in the snow. The woman lay crumpled beside the dying embers of a fire. Her body, so still he thought she was already dead. Blood stained the snow beneath her head, and her breath came in shallow, rattling gasps that barely disturbed the falling snowflakes settling on her lips. He'd been riding through the Colorado blizzard for 12 hours, fighting his way toward the mining camp where urgent telegrams said miners were dying of fever. His horse had finally collapsed from exhaustion, and now he was on foot, lost in the white hell of Thunder Mountain, when he saw the orange flicker of her fire through the storm. She was Native American, Ute, from the beadwork on her torn dress, and she was maybe 25 years old, though pain and illness had carved lines around her dark eyes. When she heard his boots crunching through the snow, those eyes snapped open with the wild terror of a hunted animal. "Don't," she whispered in English, trying to crawl away from him. "Please, just let me die." But Jacob was already kneeling beside her, his medical bag open, his hands moving with practiced efficiency despite the numbing cold. Her pulse was racing, thready and weak. Fever burned through her body, even as hypothermia claimed her extremities. Pneumonia, advanced, deadly, and she was hours from death. "I'm a doctor," he said, wrapping his coat around her shivering form. "I'm going to help you." She tried to push him away, but she was too weak. You don't understand. They're hunting me. If they find you with me." "Who's hunting you?" But she was already slipping back into unconsciousness, her head lolling against his chest. Jacob looked around at the storm raging through the pines, at the shelter she'd built that was already collapsing under the weight of snow, at the dead fire that had been her only protection against the killing cold. The mining camp was still 8 miles away through terrain that would challenge a healthy man on a good day. The storm showed no signs of stopping. His horse was finished, and this woman, this stranger, would be dead within the hour if he didn't act. Jacob Mueller had taken an oath to preserve life. He'd also buried his wife 3 years ago when no doctor could reach her in time. He'd sworn that day that he would never let distance or danger keep him from answering a call for help. But this wasn't a call for help. This was a woman who'd been left to die alone in the snow, and everything about her terror told him that whoever was hunting her wouldn't hesitate to kill him too. He should leave her. Any rational man would. The smart thing was to push on to the camp, to save the lives he was certain he could save instead of risking everything for a stranger who was probably beyond help. Jacob lifted her in his arms. "I'm going to carry you," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him. "I'm going to get you to safety." The decision was made. 8 miles through a blizzard, carrying a dying woman, with killers somewhere behind them in the storm. Jacob adjusted her weight against his chest, felt her fevered breath against his neck, and began to walk. He had no idea that this moment, this choice to save a stranger's life, would change everything. That by morning, he would be willing to die for her. That she would teach him what love truly meant. That their journey through the darkness would lead to a sunrise more beautiful than any he'd ever imagined. All he knew was that she was dying, and he was the only one who could save her. So he walked into the storm, carrying his burden toward whatever lay ahead, driven by something deeper than duty, a desperate need to prove that in a world full of cruelty and hatred, one person could still make a difference. The wind howled around them like a living thing, and the snow fell harder, but Jacob Mueller had made his choice. He would not let her die alone. Jacob moved with practiced efficiency, his hands steady despite the cold that numbed his fingers. He pulled a small bottle of laudanum from his bag, along with a tin cup that he quickly filled with snow. The snow melted against the warmth of his palm, providing enough liquid to help the woman swallow the bitter medicine that would ease her pain and quiet her cough. He lifted her head gently, supporting her neck as he helped her drink. She tried to speak, but the words came out as barely a whisper in a language he didn't recognize. Not English, not even Ute, but something older, more primal. Her voice was hoarse from coughing, and when she tried to sit up, Jacob could hear the wet rattle in her chest that confirmed his diagnosis. "Save your strength," he murmured, wrapping his own heavy coat around her slight frame. She was burning with fever, but her extremities were dangerously cold, her hands like ice, her feet probably frostbitten beneath the worn moccasins she wore. The combination of fever and hypothermia was killing her as surely as the disease in her lungs. Jacob worked quickly, using his body heat to warm her hands while he examined her more thoroughly. Her breathing was labored, each breath an obvious effort that left her more exhausted than the last. Her lips were cracked and dry, and when he looked into her eyes, he could see the glazed look of someone deep in the grip of fever. She was young, he realized, probably no more than 25, though illness and hardship had etched lines around her eyes that made her seem older. Her long black hair was matted with snow and sweat, and her clothes, while well-made, were insufficient protection against the mountain winter. She had been traveling light, probably on foot, which meant she had been running from something urgent enough to make her risk her life in a winter storm. With the storm worsening by the minute, Jacob knew they couldn't stay here. The crude shelter she'd built against the boulder was ingenious. She'd used fallen branches and pine boughs to create a windbreak, and had somehow managed to start a fire despite the wet conditions. But it was a temporary refuge at best, and the increasing wind would soon collapse the fragile structure. There wasn't enough fuel to keep a fire going through the night, and the cold would kill her long before the pneumonia did. He had to get her to the mining camp, where there would be warmth, shelter, and the supplies he needed to treat her properly. But his horse was already exhausted from the long climb, and Jacob could see in the animal's eyes the same weariness he felt in his own bones. He lifted her in his arms, surprised by how light she was. Fever had burned away what little flesh she'd had, leaving her feeling fragile as a bird in his embrace. Through the delirium of fever, she seemed to understand what he was doing, her hand gripping weakly at his shirt as if trying to anchor herself to consciousness. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and he could feel the heat radiating from her skin even through his clothes. Jacob settled her in the saddle as carefully as he could, then climbed up behind her, cradling her against his chest. She fit perfectly in the circle of his arms, and he found himself adjusting his position to shield her from the worst of the wind. His horse snorted and shifted beneath their combined weight, but the animal was well-trained and responded to Jacob's gentle urging. The journey through the storm became a nightmare of white darkness and howling wind. Jacob's horse struggled through drifts that reached its belly, following a trail that disappeared and reappeared in the swirling snow like a phantom path. The wind cut through Jacob's clothes as if they were made of paper, and without his heavy coat, he could feel the cold settling deep into his bones. Several times, they had to stop when the trail became completely obscured, and Jacob had to dismount and lead the animal around fallen trees or through particularly deep drifts. During these moments, he would wrap the woman more tightly in his coat, speaking to her in low, soothing tones even though he wasn't sure she could hear him over the wind. The woman in his arms drifted in and out of consciousness like a ship riding dangerous swells. Sometimes she would mumble in her native tongue, words that sounded like prayers or perhaps the names of people she'd left behind. Other times she would cry out in pain, her body convulsing with coughing fits that left flecks of blood on her lips. Jacob did what he could, adjusting her position to ease her breathing, sharing his body heat, but he knew she was slipping away with each passing hour. The storm seemed to have a malevolent intelligence, striking at them from every direction. The wind would die down just long enough for Jacob to think they'd found shelter, then roar back with renewed fury. Snow got in their eyes, their mouths, melting and refreezing on their clothes until they were both coated in ice. Near midnight, when the storm reached its full fury, Jacob's horse finally gave out. The animal had given everything it had, but the combination of exhaustion, cold, and the increasingly treacherous terrain was too much. Jacob felt the gelding's legs buckle beneath them, and he barely managed to slide from the saddle with the woman in his arms before the horse collapsed into a snowdrift. The animal wasn't dead. Jacob could see its flanks heaving with exhaustion, but it was finished for the night. They were still miles from the mining camp, and the storm showed no signs of abating. Jacob managed to coax the gelding to its feet and lead it to a small grove of pines that offered some shelter from the wind, but he knew they could go no further on horseback. He looked down at the woman in his arms, her face pale now except for the fever spots that burned on her cheeks like brands. She was dying, and they were still miles from help. The smart thing to do would be to try to build a shelter, start a fire, and wait for the storm to pass. But Jacob had seen enough mountain storms to know that this one could last for days, and the woman didn't have days. She might not even have hours. But Jacob Mueller had not survived 3 years of frontier medicine by giving up when things looked impossible. He had come too far, invested too much of himself in this stranger's life to surrender now. He wrapped her more tightly in his coat and lifted her from the saddle, settling her weight against his chest. "I'm going to carry you," he said, though he wasn't sure she could hear him over the howling wind. "I'm going to get you to safety, I promise." And with that, he stepped back into the storm, carrying his burden toward whatever lay ahead in the darkness. The woman stirred as Jacob lifted her, her eyes opening with sudden alarm. When she saw his face so close to hers, illuminated by the dim reflection of snow, she tried to pull away, fear overriding her weakness. She spoke rapidly in Ute, her voice barely audible but filled with distress and something that sounded like pleading. "No, no," Jacob said gently, his voice barely carrying over the wind. "I'm trying to help you. Doctor. Medicine." He pointed to himself with one hand while supporting her with the other, then gestured toward his medical bag, which he'd slung across his shoulder. "Medicine," he repeated, hoping she would understand the word if not the language. She studied his face in the dim light filtering through the storm clouds, her dark eyes searching for something. Perhaps the cruelty she'd learned to expect from white men in remote places, or the kindness that seemed too dangerous to trust. Her breathing came in sharp, painful gasps, and Jacob could see the effort it took for her to remain conscious. Jacob understood her fear with a clarity that made his chest tight. Out here in the wilderness, miles from any settlement, a lone native woman was vulnerable in ways that made his heart ache. She had every reason to fear him, no reason to trust him. The history between their peoples was written in blood and broken promises, and she had no way of knowing that he was different from the men who had probably driven her to this desperate flight. Her resistance faded not from acceptance, but from sheer exhaustion. She simply didn't have the strength to fight him, even if she'd wanted to. Her head fell back against his shoulder, and she closed her eyes, though Jacob could feel the tension in her body, the way she held herself ready to flee if the opportunity arose. He began walking, the woman cradled against his chest, her slight weight distributed across his arms and shoulders. The snow was knee-deep now, and each step was a struggle that sent shooting pains through his legs. The wind seemed to push against them with deliberate malice, and Jacob had to lean into it to make any progress at all. His legs burned with the effort, and his breathing came in harsh puffs that froze instantly in the frigid air. The woman's body heat helped warm his chest, but his arms and legs were growing numb with cold. He tried to calculate the distance to the mining camp, but the storm had disoriented him, and he was no longer certain which direction they were traveling. "Anna," she whispered suddenly, her voice so soft he almost missed it over the wind. "Anna, singing bird." Jacob looked down at her in surprise. She was watching him with eyes that were clearer now, as if the fever had temporarily broken or perhaps the cold had shocked her into lucidity. Her lips were blue with cold, but there was an intelligence in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "Anna," he repeated, and she nodded slightly, the movement barely perceptible. "Anna Singing Bird. That's a beautiful name." "Jacob," he said, shifting her weight slightly so he could touch his chest. "Dr. Jacob Mueller." She tried to say his name, but it came out as barely more than a whisper. Her pronunciation was careful, as if she were trying to memorize the sound of it. Then her eyes closed again, and she was quiet except for the labored sound of her breathing and the occasional cough that shook her entire body. They walked through the night, Jacob's legs mechanically carrying them forward while his mind focused on the rhythm of her breathing, the warmth of her body against his. The storm seemed to ebb and flow around them, sometimes dying down to almost nothing, other times returning with renewed fury that nearly knocked them off their feet. Whenever she stirred, Jacob spoke to her softly, telling her about the sunrise that was coming, about the camp where there would be warm food and clean beds, about the medicines he would use to fight the infection in her lungs. He told her about the stove that would chase away the cold, about the blankets that would wrap her in warmth, about the hot soup that would restore her strength. He wasn't sure she understood his words, but something in his voice seemed to calm her. Her grip on his shirt would tighten whenever he spoke, as if his voice were an anchor in the storm of her illness. Sometimes she would murmur responses in her own language, words that sounded like questions or perhaps expressions of gratitude. The hours passed in a blur of white darkness and numbing cold. Jacob's world had narrowed to the next step, the next breath, the next moment of keeping both of them alive. His back ached from carrying her, and his arms had progressed beyond numbness to a deep, throbbing pain that he tried to ignore. But still he walked, driven by something deeper than duty or professional obligation. This woman, Anna Singing Bird, had become his responsibility in a way that transcended the normal relationship between doctor and patient. He had found her dying in the snow, and in accepting that burden, he had accepted something more fundamental, the obligation to see her through to safety or die trying. The storm showed no mercy, but neither did Jacob Mueller. Step by step, hour by hour, he carried her through the darkness toward whatever hope lay ahead. As the hours passed, and the storm continued its relentless assault, Jacob found himself talking to Anna more freely. His voice became the only sound besides the wind and the crunch of snow under his boots, a constant murmur of words that seemed to create a small bubble of humanity in the vast wilderness around them. He told her about his childhood in Pennsylvania, about growing up in a house that always smelled of his mother's bread and his father's pipe tobacco. He described the medical school in Philadelphia, the long nights studying anatomy by candlelight, the first patient he'd ever saved, and the first one he'd lost. He spoke of the patients he'd treated in mining camps across the West, the injuries and illnesses that had taught him more about medicine than any textbook ever could. "My wife used to say I talked too much when I was nervous," he said, adjusting his grip as they navigated around a fallen log that blocked their path. The wood was slick with ice, and Jacob had to be careful not to slip as he stepped over it. She was probably right about that. Sarah always said I could talk a man's ear off if I set my mind to it. But you're a good listener, Anna Singing Bird. When she was awake, Anna seemed to find genuine comfort in his voice. Her breathing would become less labored, and sometimes she would look up at him with an expression that was almost peaceful. The fever that had been burning her up seemed to ebb and flow like a tide, and during the quieter moments, she would watch his face with eyes that held a growing trust. During one of these clearer moments, as they rested beside a large boulder that provided temporary shelter from the wind, she spoke in halting English, her voice barely audible but carefully formed. "Why? You help?" she asked, each word obviously an effort. Jacob considered the question as he pulled his water bottle from his bag and helped her drink. The water was nearly frozen, but it was wet, and her lips were cracked from fever and cold. "Because you needed help," he said finally. "Because no one should die alone in the snow. Because it's what I do." She was quiet for a long time after that, her eyes fixed on his face as if she were trying to memorize his features. When she looked at him again, the fear that had been there earlier was gone, replaced by something else, a cautious trust that made Jacob's chest tight with emotion. "Your wife," she said softly. "She gone?" Jacob nodded, surprised by the directness of the question. 3 years ago. Pneumonia, like you have. I couldn't save her." Anna's hand found his, her fingers ice-cold but strong enough to squeeze. "Sorry," she whispered. "Sorry for your loss." The simple words, spoken with such obvious sincerity, hit Jacob harder than he'd expected. He'd heard countless expressions of sympathy over the years, but something about Anna's broken English and the effort it took for her to speak made the sentiment feel more genuine than all the formal condolences he'd received. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "That means more than you know." As they continued their journey through the storm, Jacob found himself sharing things he hadn't spoken about in years. He told Anna about Sarah, about their brief marriage and the dreams they'd shared for a family that would never come. He spoke of his guilt, his sense of failure, the way he'd thrown himself into his work as a way of trying to make amends for the life he hadn't been able to save. "I became a doctor to help people," he said as they struggled through a particularly deep drift. "But when it mattered most, when the person I loved needed help, I couldn't do anything. I just watched her die." Anna stirred in his arms, and he looked down to see her watching him with eyes that were clearer than they'd been all night. "Not your fault," she said, her voice stronger now. "Death chooses its own time." "Maybe," Jacob said, "but it doesn't make it easier to live with." Near dawn, when the storm had begun to show signs of weakening, they stopped to rest beside a stream that still ran beneath a thin layer of ice. Jacob managed to break through the ice with the heel of his boot and get Anna some water, supporting her head as she drank. She was so weak she could barely swallow, but she managed to get down a few sips before exhaustion overtook her again. Thank you, she whispered when she was finished, the words clear despite her illness. Jacob felt something shift inside him, a connection that went beyond the normal relationship between doctor and patient. This woman, this stranger he'd found dying in the snow, had touched something in his heart that had been closed off since his wife's death. She had reminded him of why he'd become a doctor in the first place. Not for the glory or the respect, but for moments like this, when skill and compassion could make the difference between life and death. We're almost there, he lied, because the camp was still hours away and he wasn't sure he had the strength to make it. But he couldn't let her lose hope now, not when she was fighting so hard to stay alive. Just hold on a little longer. Anna's hand found his again, her fingers slightly warmer now, as if the water had helped restore some of her strength. Sunrise, she whispered, looking toward the eastern peaks where the sky was beginning to lighten with the first faint hint of dawn. Want to see one more sunrise? Jacob looked toward the mountains, where the darkness was indeed beginning to give way to gray. The storm was weakening, and for the first time in hours, he could see more than a few feet ahead. The sight of the coming dawn filled him with a hope he hadn't felt since they'd started this desperate journey. You will, he promised, his voice firm with determination. I'll make sure you do. One more sunrise, and a singing bird. I promise you that. And somehow, carrying her in his arms as the world began to lighten around them, Jacob believed it was a promise he could keep. The sound of horses in the distance made Jacob freeze in his tracks. Through the pre-dawn gloom, he could see dark shapes moving with purpose through the snow. For men on horseback, their mounts' breath visible in the cold air as they approached. Jacob's heart sank as he recognized the leader, even at a distance. Marcus Garrett, the territorial marshal who'd made his hatred of Native Americans well known throughout the Colorado Territory. Garrett was a tall, lean man with cold eyes and a reputation for violence that extended far beyond his official duties. He wore his authority like a weapon, and Jacob had heard too many stories about his methods to have any illusions about what his presence meant. The three men riding with him were cut from the same cloth. Hardened men who saw their badges as licenses for cruelty rather than symbols of justice. Well, Garrett called out as he rode closer, his voice carrying an edge of satisfaction that made Jacob's blood run cold. Dr. Jacob Mueller. Heard you were heading up to the camp to tend to some sick miners. Didn't expect to find you out here playing nursemaid to a squaw. Jacob's grip tightened protectively around Anna, who had gone rigid in his arms at the sound of Garrett's voice. Even in her fevered state, she seemed to recognize the danger these men represented. Her hand clutched at Jacob's shirt, and he could feel her trembling. Whether from fever or fear, he couldn't tell. She's sick, Marshal, Jacob said, trying to keep his voice steady and professional. Dying, actually. I found her unconscious in the snow, and I'm taking her to the camp for medical treatment. Garrett's three companions had spread out in a loose semicircle, effectively blocking the trail ahead. All of them were armed, and Jacob recognized the type. Men who'd gravitated toward law enforcement not out of any sense of justice, but because it gave them legal cover for the violence they enjoyed inflicting. I don't think so, Doc, Garrett said, dismounting with deliberate slowness. His movements were those of a predator who knew his prey couldn't escape. This here's one of them Ute that's been causing trouble down in the valley. Stealing cattle, harassing decent folks. Been tracking her for the better part of a week. She's been unconscious with fever for hours, Jacob protested, his voice rising despite his efforts to remain calm. She couldn't have stolen anything. Look at her. She can barely breathe, let alone rustle cattle. That's not for you to decide, Doc, Garrett said, walking closer with his hand resting casually on the butt of his pistol. You got no authority here, Mueller. This is territorial business, and that makes it my jurisdiction. Anna stirred in Jacob's arms, her eyes opening to focus on the marshal with obvious recognition. When she saw him, a sound escaped her lips, not quite a cry, but something closer to a moan of despair. She tried to speak, but Garrett cut her off with a sharp gesture. Save your breath, girl, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. You're coming with us. Got some questions to ask you about missing livestock and a couple of dead ranchers. Like hell she is, Jacob said, the words coming out of his mouth before he could stop them. She's my patient, Marshal. She's under my medical care, and I'm not turning her over to anyone until she's well enough to travel. Garrett's smile was cold and humorless. Your patient? He laughed, but there was no warmth in the sound. "Doc, you've been carrying this savage through the snow all night, holding her real close like. Makes a man wonder exactly what kind of doctoring you've been doing up here in the dark." The implication hit Jacob like a physical blow. He felt Anna flinch in his arms, and something dark and protective rose up in his chest, a fury unlike anything he'd felt since his wife's death. "Marshall, I'm warning you." "You're warning me?" Garrett's laughter was genuinely amused now. "Doc, you're alone on a mountain with a dying Indian and 4 armed men. Weather's clearing, which means tracks are going to be easier to follow. I'd say you're in no position to warn anybody about anything." The other 3 riders had their hands on their weapons now, waiting for Garrett's signal. Jacob realized with growing horror that they hadn't come to arrest Anna. They'd come to kill her, and probably him too if he got in their way. This wasn't about justice or stolen cattle. This was about men who'd found a convenient excuse to satisfy their hatred. "Please," Jacob said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "She's done nothing wrong. She's dying, Marshall. Whatever you think she's done, she's paying for it now. At least let her die with dignity." Garrett's expression hardened, and Jacob saw something in his eyes that made his blood turn to ice. "Dignity?" he spat. "Doc, you've been out here too long. You're starting to think like one of them. This is how it's going to be. You hand over the squaw, and we'll let you walk away. Try to be a hero, and you'll die with her. Your choice." Anna's hand found Jacob's chest, pressing against his heart. She was looking up at him with eyes that held no fear now, only a kind of sad acceptance. She whispered something in Ute, words that sounded like a prayer or perhaps a goodbye, then switched to English. "Let me go," she said softly, her voice barely audible but filled with a strength that belied her physical weakness. "You done enough. More than enough." "No," Jacob said, his voice firm and final. "I'm not letting you go." Garrett was growing impatient, and Jacob could see the violence building in his eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "Doc, you got 10 seconds to make up your mind. This don't have to be complicated." Jacob looked at the marshal, then at his men, then down at Anna. He thought of his wife, of the oath he'd taken as a doctor, of the moment he'd found this woman dying in the snow. Some decisions, he realized, weren't really decisions at all. They were simply revelations of who you truly were, stripped of all pretense and social convention. "Marshal," he said quietly, "I took an oath to do no harm. That includes standing by while you murder an innocent woman." Anna's grip tightened on his shirt, and he could feel her trying to pull away. "Jacob," she whispered, using his name for the first time. "Run. Please. Don't die, for me." But Jacob was already moving, not away from the marshals, but toward a cluster of boulders that would provide cover. The decision had been made, and there was no going back now. "Hold on," he told Anna, and began to run. Garrett's shout followed them through the morning air. "Stop him. Don't let them reach the rocks." The crack of gunfire split the dawn, and Jacob felt a bullet whistle past his ear close enough to burn. He dove behind the nearest boulder, cradling Anna against his chest, his heart hammering with adrenaline and terror. The rocks were large enough to provide cover, but he knew it was only temporary. They were trapped, and Garrett had all the time in the world. "You made your choice, Doc," Garrett called out, his voice echoing off the stone around them. "Now you get to live with it, for about 5 more minutes." Jacob pressed deeper into the rocky shelter, trying to make himself and Anna as small a target as possible. She was looking up at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, part wonder, part sorrow, part something that might have been love. The fever had given her eyes an unusual brightness, but there was clarity there too, as if the proximity of death had sharpened her perception. "I'm sorry," Jacob said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm so sorry I got you into this. If I'd just minded my own business." "No," Anna interrupted, her voice stronger than it had been all night. She reached up and touched his face, her fingers cold but gentle. "You gave me something beautiful, someone who cared, if I lived or died. That's more than I ever hoped for." Tears stung Jacob's eyes, whether from the cold or emotion he couldn't say. "You're going to live," he said fiercely. "Do you hear me? You're going to live, and we're going to get out of this." But even as he spoke the words, Jacob knew how unlikely that was. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped. The only thing in their favor was the rocky terrain, which would make it difficult for the marshals to approach without exposing themselves. But difficult wasn't impossible, and Jacob had no weapons except for the surgical instruments in his medical bag. "Tell me about your family," he said, trying to keep Anna talking, trying to keep her focused on something other than the men who were slowly closing in around them. "Do you have children?" "Parents." Anna's eyes grew distant, and Jacob thought she might not answer. Then, in a voice so soft he had to strain to hear it, she began to speak. "Had a daughter," she said. "Little bird, like me. She would have been 5 summers now." "Would have been?" Jacob asked gently. "Soldiers came to our camp last winter. Said we were harboring fugitives. Burned everything. My daughter, she got the coughing sickness after. No medicine, no warmth. She died in my arms." Jacob felt his heart break for her, understanding now why she'd been alone in the mountains, why she'd seemed so resigned to death. She'd already lost everything that mattered to her. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "I'm so sorry." After that, I had nothing left. Wandered the mountains, looking for, I don't know what. Peace, maybe. Or just a place to die quietly. She looked up at him again, and this time there was something like gratitude in her eyes. "You gave me something I thought was gone forever." "What's that?" "Hope," she said simply. "For just a little while, you made me believe that maybe there was still goodness in the world. That maybe someone could care about Anna singing bird." Jacob felt tears running down his cheeks now, freezing in the cold air. "I do care," he said. "More than you know. More than I understood until right now." The sound of footsteps on stone told Jacob that the marshals were moving closer, but for the moment, he didn't care. All his attention was focused on the woman in his arms, on the way the growing light revealed the fine-boned structure of her face, the intelligence in her dark eyes, the quiet strength that had kept her alive through unimaginable loss. "What was her name?" he asked. "Your daughter." Anna's face softened, and for a moment, the years of hardship fell away, revealing the young mother she'd once been. "Morningstar," she said. "She was born just as the sun came up, and she was so beautiful, like sunlight made flesh." "Tell me about her," Jacob said, adjusting his position to better shield Anna from the wind that was still whipping around the rocks. "She had my eyes, but her father's smile," Anna said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "Always laughing, always getting into mischief. She loved the horses, used to sneak into the corral to feed them grass. I would find her there, covered in mud, talking to them like they were her friends." "Where is her father now?" Anna's expression grew dark. "Dead. Killed by the same soldiers who burned our camp. He tried to protect us, but—" She shrugged, a gesture that spoke of acceptance rather than defeat. "It was a bad winter. Bad for everyone." Jacob felt a surge of protective anger that surprised him with its intensity. This woman had suffered more in her short life than most people could imagine, and yet she was still fighting, still clinging to life with a determination that humbled him. "Anna," he said, his voice intense with emotion, "I need you to know something. If this doesn't end well, I want you to know that meeting you, carrying you through the snow, it's been the most important thing I've ever done. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What?" she asked, echoing his earlier question. "A reason to fight," Jacob said. "A reason to believe that what I do matters. You've reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place." Anna stared at him for a long moment, and Jacob saw something change in her expression, a kind of wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "You would die for me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes," Jacob said without hesitation. "I would, and I will, if that's what it takes to keep you safe." The words hung in the air between them, and Jacob realized that he meant them completely. Somewhere in the long night of carrying her through the storm, this woman had become more than just a patient to him. She had become his responsibility, his purpose, his reason for being in this place at this moment. "Jacob," Anna said, her voice filled with emotions he couldn't name. "Good man. Heart like sunrise. Warm, full of light." Before Jacob could respond, the sound of Garrett's voice cut through the morning air. "Dr. Mueller, I'm a patient man, but my patience has limits. You got 1 minute to send out the squaw, or we're coming in after both of you." Jacob looked down at Anna, who was watching him with eyes that held both love and fear. Love for his courage, fear for his safety. She was trying to sit up, trying to pull away from him, and he realized she was going to try to surrender herself to save him. "No," he said firmly, holding her still. Don't even think about it. They kill you, because of me, she whispered, her voice breaking. Not right. Not fair to you. Anna, listen to me, Jacob said, turning her face toward his and forcing her to meet his eyes. My wife died because I wasn't there when she needed me. I couldn't save her, and I've lived with that failure every day since. But I can save you. I won't let them take you. I won't let you die alone. She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw something change in her expression, a kind of wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. You would really do that for me? I would, Jacob said, his voice steady and sure. I am. Anna reached up and touched his face again, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw with infinite tenderness. Then I will live, she said, her voice filled with a new determination. For you. For us. For the sunrise you promised me. Jacob felt something shift inside his chest, something that had been broken since his wife's death suddenly clicking back into place. Together, he said, we'll face whatever comes next together. The sound of boots on stone grew closer, and Jacob knew their time was running out. He reached for his medical bag, pulling out the sharpest scalpel he had. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was better than nothing. Anna, he said urgently, there's something I need you to know. In case we don't make it out of this. These past few hours, carrying you through the snow, talking to you, they've been the most real, the most important hours of my life. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. What? She asked, her voice barely audible. The ability to love, Jacob said simply. To care about someone more than I care about myself. To believe that one person can make a difference in the world. Anna's eyes filled with tears, and she reached up to pull his face down to hers. Jacob, she whispered. My Jacob. Heart like sunrise, soul like home. And in that moment, surrounded by danger and cold and the possibility of death, Jacob Mueller realized that he had found something worth fighting for. Something worth dying for, if necessary. He had found love in the most unexpected place, with the most unexpected person, and he wasn't going to let anyone take it away from him. Not without a fight. The marshals had them surrounded now, their voices calling out from different positions as they closed in on the rocky shelter. Jacob pressed deeper into the cluster of boulders, and his breathing growing more labored with each passing moment. The exertion of their desperate flight, combined with the pneumonia ravaging her lungs, was taking its toll. He could feel her body trembling against his, whether from fever, cold, or fear he couldn't tell. Doc! Garrett's voice echoed off the stone around them, amplified and distorted until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. You're just making this harder on yourself and the girl. Send her out, and maybe we'll let you live to see another sunrise. Jacob felt Anna struggling weakly in his arms, trying to sit up, trying to pull away from him. Even in her weakened state, she was attempting to sacrifice herself to save him. The nobility of the gesture, coming from someone who had already lost everything, made Jacob's chest tight with emotion. No, he said firmly, holding her still against his chest. Don't even think about it. I'm not letting you go. They kill you, because of me, she whispered, her voice breaking with the effort to speak. Not right. You have whole life ahead. I have nothing left. Anna, listen to me, Jacob said, turning her face toward his and forcing her to meet his eyes. The fever had given her skin an almost translucent quality, but her gaze was steady and clear. My wife died because I wasn't there when she needed me most. I was away, treating other patients, and when I came home, it was too late. I couldn't save her, and I've lived with that failure every day since. He paused, gathering his thoughts, acutely aware that these might be the last words he ever spoke to her. But I can save you. I won't let them take you. I won't let you die alone in fear and pain. Not after everything you've been through. Anna stared at him for a long moment, and Jacob saw something change in her expression, a kind of wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. The idea that someone would willingly die for her, a woman who had been cast out and hunted, seemed almost incomprehensible. You would really die for me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Yes, Jacob said without hesitation, his voice steady and sure. I would, and I will, if that's what it takes to keep you safe. The sound of boots on stone grew closer, and Jacob knew their time was running out. He reached for his medical bag, pulling out the sharpest scalpel he had. The blade gleamed in the growing light, And while it wasn't much of a weapon against 4 armed men, it was better than nothing. "They're behind the big rock cluster," one of the marshals shouted, his voice carrying clearly in the thin mountain air. "I can see movement." Jacob could hear them coordinating their approach, spreading out to cover all possible escape routes. These weren't the fumbling efforts of amateurs. They moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had done this kind of thing before. "Anna," Jacob said urgently, his voice low and intense. "There's something I need you to know. In case we don't make it out of this alive. These past few hours, carrying you through the snow, talking to you, getting to know you, they've been the most important hours of my life. You've given me back something I thought I'd lost forever." "What?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the sound of approaching footsteps. "The ability to love," Jacob said simply. "To care about someone more than I care about myself. To believe that one person can make a difference in the world, that kindness and compassion still matter." Anna's eyes filled with tears, and she reached up to pull his face down closer to hers. "Jacob," she whispered, her voice filled with emotions he couldn't name. "My Jacob, heart like sunrise, soul like home I never thought I'd find." The sound of gunfire erupted around them, bullets ricocheting off the rocks with sharp, metallic cracks. Jacob curled his body around Anna, shielding her from the flying stone chips and lead fragments. He could hear Garrett shouting orders, the other marshals responding, their voices growing closer with each passing moment. "Last chance, Doc." Garrett's voice was closer now, maybe 30 yards away. "I'm done playing games. You got 10 seconds to send out the squaw, or we're coming in shooting." Jacob looked down at Anna, who was watching him with eyes that held no fear now. Only a kind of peaceful acceptance mixed with something that looked remarkably like love. She was dying, he realized with a clarity that cut through him like a blade. The pneumonia was winning its battle against her weakened system, and even if they somehow escaped the marshals, he wasn't sure he could save her. But he could try. He could keep trying until the very end, fighting for every breath, every heartbeat, every moment they had left together. "Anna," he said softly, brushing a strand of dark hair away from her fevered face. "Can you see the sunrise?" She turned her head slightly, looking toward the eastern peaks where the sky was beginning to glow with the first real light of dawn. The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and ice, beautiful and terrible in its pristine emptiness. "Yes," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "So beautiful. Like the world being born again." "One more," Jacob promised, his voice fierce with determination. "I'm going to give you one more sunrise, and a singing bird. And then another after that, and another, for as long as we both shall live." The sound of heavy footsteps on stone was very close now, and Jacob knew they had only seconds left. He gripped the scalpel tighter, knowing it was inadequate against the odds they faced, but unwilling to surrender without a fight. "I love you," he said suddenly, the words coming from some deep place in his soul that he hadn't even known existed. "I know it's crazy. I know we barely know each other, but I love you, Anna. I love your courage, your strength, your gentleness. I love the way you fought to stay alive when anyone else would have given up." Anna's eyes widened, and fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered back. "My brave doctor. My guardian angel. You carried me through the darkness, and now I want to walk into the light with you." Jacob felt his heart swell with an emotion so intense it was almost painful. Here, in what might be their final moments, they had found something that most people spent their entire lives searching for. Love, real and true and uncomplicated by the petty concerns of the world. "Together," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Whatever comes next, we face it together." The marshals were almost upon them now, and Jacob could see movement through the gaps in the rocks. He positioned himself to shield Anna as much as possible, the scalpel ready in his hand, his body tensed for what might be their final stand. But then, cutting through the morning air like a gift from heaven, came the sound of horses approaching fast, many horses, moving with purpose and urgency. Through the gunfire and shouting, Jacob heard something that made his heart leap with hope. "Dr. Mueller! Dr. Mueller, where are you?" It was a voice he recognized, Tom Brady, the foreman of the mining camp, calling his name with urgent concern. The cavalry, it seemed, had arrived. The thundering of hooves grew louder, and Jacob could see them now. A dozen men on horseback, led by Tom Brady himself. The mining camp crew had finally come looking for him when he didn't arrive as scheduled. They'd heard the gunfire echoing across the mountains and were riding hard toward the sound, their faces grim with determination. "Garrett," Brady's voice boomed across the snow-covered landscape, carrying the authority of a man who commanded respect through deed rather than badge. "What the hell is going on here? Why are you shooting at our doctor?" The marshal emerged from behind a boulder, his face flushed with anger and frustration. His carefully laid plans were crumbling around him, and Jacob could see the desperation in his eyes, the look of a man who had gone too far to back down now. "This is territorial business, Brady," Garrett said, his voice strained but still carrying the arrogance of official authority. "That doctor's got a wanted Indian with him. Dangerous fugitive. I'm authorized to use whatever force necessary to apprehend her." "Wanted for what?" Brady dismounted from his horse with deliberate slowness, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. Jacob knew the foreman well, a fair man who had hired native workers in the past and treated them with the same respect he showed his white employees. If anyone could defuse this situation, it would be Brady. "Cattle rustling," Garrett said, but his voice lacked conviction now that he was facing a dozen armed men instead of one exhausted doctor. "Murder of a rancher down in the valley. Been tracking her for days." "Bullshit," Brady said flatly, his voice carrying across the clearing with the force of absolute certainty. "I know this woman. Name's Anna Singing Bird. She's been trading with our camp for months. Brings us fresh game and medicinal herbs. We give her supplies and ammunition. She's never stolen so much as a horseshoe, and she sure as hell never killed anyone." Jacob felt Anna stir in his arms as she heard her name spoken with such obvious respect and affection. She was trying to sit up, to see what was happening, but she was too weak to do more than lift her head slightly. "It's okay," Jacob told her softly, his voice filled with relief and growing hope. "Help is here. Real help." Garrett's face was dark with rage, and Jacob could see the violence building in his expression like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "You calling me a liar, Brady?" "I'm calling you a lot of things," Brady said, his voice steady and unafraid. "But we can start with liar and work our way up to murderer. You were fixing to kill an innocent woman and a good doctor. That makes you about as low as a man can get." The tension in the clearing was palpable, like the moment before lightning strikes. Jacob knew it could still go either way, guns drawn, blood spilled, more death in the snow. But he also knew that this was the moment when he had to make a choice, when he had to decide whether to remain hidden or to trust in the goodness of men like Brady. "Stand down, Marshal," Brady continued, his voice like ice. "Now, before this goes any further." The other miners had spread out in a loose semicircle, their rifles visible but not yet raised. They were outnumbered by Garrett's men, but they had the advantage of knowing they were in the right. Jacob could see the determination in their faces, the quiet resolve of men who had decided to do the right thing regardless of the cost. Jacob made his decision. He stood up slowly, Anna cradled carefully in his arms, and walked out from behind the rocks. Both groups of men turned to look at him, and Jacob felt the weight of their stares, the importance of the moment. "This woman is dying," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the snow. "Her name is Anna Singing Bird, and I found her last night, alone and desperately ill. I've been carrying her toward the camp, trying to save her life. That's all. Nothing more, nothing less." He looked directly at Garrett, his eyes steady and unafraid. "Marshal, I'm a doctor. I've examined this woman thoroughly. She's been unconscious with fever for hours. She couldn't have stolen anything or hurt anyone. She's innocent of whatever crimes you think she's committed." Brady stepped forward, his eyes taking in Anna's fevered face, her labored breathing, the way she clung weakly to Jacob's shirt. "Jesus Christ, document. How long has she been like this?" "Since I found her," Jacob said. "She needs immediate medical attention, or she's going to die. The pneumonia is advanced, and she's been exposed to the cold for too long." "You heard him," Brady said to his men, his voice brooking no argument. "Get the doc and Anna to camp. Now, whatever's wrong with her, we'll fix it." But Garrett wasn't finished. His hand moved to his gun, and Jacob saw the madness in his eyes, the look of a man who had gone too far down a dark path to turn back now. "I said this is territorial business," Garrett snarled, his voice rising with desperation. I got authority here, and I'm taking that Indian back with me, dead or alive. And I said stand down, Brady repeated, his voice carrying a new edge of steel. You want to start a war over one sick woman, Marshall? Because that's what you'll get. These men know Anna. They respect her. They're not going to let you hurt her. Jacob looked around at the faces of the miners, seeing the truth of Brady's words reflected in their expressions. These were hard men, shaped by years of dangerous work and frontier life, but they were also fair men. They had dealt with Anna as a trading partner and had found her to be honest and trustworthy. They wouldn't stand by and watch her be murdered. Garrett looked around as well, and Jacob saw the moment when reality finally penetrated his rage. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and facing men who had made their choice. His own deputies were looking uncertain now, sensing the shift in the situation, realizing that they were on the wrong side of this fight. This isn't over, Garrett said finally, his voice filled with impotent fury. I'll be back with proper authority. Federal marshals, maybe even the army. This woman is going to pay for what she's done. You do that, Brady said calmly. But not today. Today, we're taking care of our own. Jacob felt tears stinging his eyes as the camp workers surrounded him, their faces filled with concern and determination. Anna was looking up at him with an expression of wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe they were safe. Sunrise, she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with hope. She gestured weakly toward the eastern peaks, where the sun was finally breaking over the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. One more, Jacob said softly, his voice thick with emotion. Just like I promised. The first of many, Anna's singing bird. As the miners helped them toward their horses, Jacob looked back at Garrett one last time. The marshal was still standing there, his face twisted with rage and frustration, but he made no move to follow. He had been outmaneuvered, outmatched, and he knew it. The sun climbed higher in the sky, chasing away the shadows of the night and the darkness of hatred. And in that moment, surrounded by good men who had chosen to do the right thing, Jacob Mueller knew that love had triumphed over prejudice, kindness over cruelty, hope over despair. They were going to live. They were going to have their sunrise, and all the ones that would follow. The mining camp bustled with activity as Jacob worked frantically to save Anna's life. The miners had cleared out the largest cabin and turned it into a makeshift hospital, bringing in extra blankets, stoking the fire until the room was warm enough to chase away the mountain cold, and boiling water for the medical supplies Jacob would need. Anna lay on a simple cot, her breathing shallow and labored, her fever dangerously high despite the warmth of the room. Jacob had been working over her for hours, using every technique he'd learned in medical school and every trick he'd picked up during his years on the frontier. He'd administered laudanum for the pain, given her digitalis to strengthen her heart, and used hot compresses to try to break the fever that was slowly killing her. But the pneumonia was winning. Jacob could hear the wet rattle in her chest growing worse, could see the way her lips were taking on a bluish tinge despite the oxygen-rich air of the mountains. She was slipping away, and there was nothing more he could do except sit beside her and wait. Doc, Brady said quietly from the doorway, his voice filled with concern. Garrett's back. He's got a federal marshal with him this time, and papers. Official papers. Says he's authorized to take Anna to Fort Collins for trial. Jacob looked up from Anna's bedside, his face haggard with exhaustion and worry. He'd been awake for more than 36 hours, and the strain was showing in every line of his body. She's dying, Tom. She can't be moved. The journey would kill her. I know, document. But they got federal authority now. Don't know if we can stop them this time. Through the window, Jacob could see Garrett and his men outside, along with a stern-faced federal marshal, a tall, gray-haired man with cold eyes and an official bearing. They were waiting with the patience of men who knew the law was on their side. But Jacob could see the tension in their postures, the way their hands never strayed far from their weapons. Anna's eyes fluttered open, focusing on Jacob's face with obvious effort. They come for me, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Yes, Jacob said, taking her hand in his. Her skin was burning hot, and her grip was weak, but she squeezed his fingers as tightly as she could. But I won't let them take you. I promised you another sunrise, and I keep my promises. She tried to smile, but it was a weak effort that quickly faded. Already saw it, she whispered. Beautiful sunrise, because of you. More beautiful than any I ever seen. Anna, don't talk like that, Jacob said, his voice fierce with determination. You're going to be fine. You're going to see 1,000 more sunrises. But they both knew it wasn't true. The fever was consuming her from the inside, and even if Garrett and his federal marshal didn't take her away, she might not survive the night. The door opened, and Garrett walked in with the federal marshal, their boots loud on the wooden floor. The federal marshal was a tall, gray-haired man with cold eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to absolute authority. Dr. Mueller, the federal marshal said, his voice carrying the weight of official business. I'm Marshal Davidson. I have a warrant for the arrest of this woman on charges of cattle rustling and murder. She's dying, Jacob said flatly, not bothering to rise from his chair beside Anna's bed. Look at her. She can barely breathe. She's in no condition to be moved, let alone stand trial. Davidson glanced at Anna with the dispassionate interest of a man examining livestock. That's not my concern, doctor. My concern is the law, and the law says she needs to answer for her crimes. What crimes? Brady stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. What did she supposedly do that's so terrible she needs to be dragged out of her deathbed? Cattle rustling, Garrett said, his voice carrying a note of triumph. Murder of a rancher named William Hayes. Happened 2 weeks ago down in the valley. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jacob felt Anna's hand squeeze his with surprising strength, and he looked down to see her trying to speak. Not true, she whispered, her voice barely audible but filled with desperate urgency. Never killed anyone. Never stole anything. She's lying, Garrett said dismissively. Indian word ain't worth much anyway. They'll say anything to save their own skins. Something snapped inside Jacob. He stood up abruptly, his face blazing with anger that had been building for hours. Marshal Davidson, this woman has been unconscious with fever for the better part of 2 days. She couldn't have murdered anyone. She could barely walk when I found her, let alone commit violent crimes. Davidson studied Jacob for a long moment, his eyes taking in the doctor's disheveled appearance, the way he stood protectively beside Anna's bed, the obvious emotion in his voice. You seem mighty attached to this woman, doctor. Makes a man wonder about the nature of your relationship. It makes a man wonder why you're more interested in persecuting the innocent than catching the guilty, Jacob shot back, his voice rising with each word. This woman is dying, and you want to drag her away from medical care to satisfy some bureaucratic requirement. Where's the justice in that? The room fell silent except for the sound of Anna's labored breathing. Brady and several of the miners had gathered in the doorway, their faces grim with anger and disgust. They had known Anna for months, had traded with her, had found her to be honest and trustworthy. The idea that she was a murderer was absurd. Anna was watching Jacob with eyes that held both love and fear. Love for his courage in defending her, fear for his safety. She struggled to sit up, her voice barely a whisper but filled with dignity. Please, she said to Davidson, her words carefully chosen despite her weakness. If I must die, let me die here. With friend. With man who cared enough to carry me through the snow. Davidson looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time since entering the room. He saw what Jacob saw, a woman burning with fever, her breathing shallow and labored, her face gaunt with illness. This wasn't the picture of a dangerous criminal. This was someone who was clearly dying. Garrett, Davidson said slowly, his voice thoughtful. You absolutely certain this is the woman you want? She doesn't look like she could rustle a chicken, let alone cattle. Positive, Garrett said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried before. She matches the description perfectly. One of the miners stepped forward, an older man named Pete who had been dealing with Anna longer than anyone. Marshal, I hate to contradict you, but I seen the woman you're looking for. Big woman, near 6 feet tall, with a scar across her left cheek, and rides a pinto horse. This here's Anna's singing bird, and she's maybe 5'4" in her stockings. They ain't the same person. Garrett's face went white, and Jacob saw the moment when the truth hit him. He'd been so blinded by his hatred, so eager to find a scapegoat, that he'd convinced himself any native woman would do. He'd been willing to kill an innocent person to satisfy his prejudice. That's not. Garrett stammered, his voice trailing off as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. Are you telling me, Davidson said, his voice dangerously quiet. That you've been chasing the wrong woman? That you were prepared to kill an innocent person based on nothing more than racial prejudice? The truth hung in the air like smoke from a gun. Everyone in the room could see it now. Garrett's hatred had led him to target Anna not because she was guilty, but because she was Native American and therefore, in his mind, inherently criminal. "This is over," Davidson said firmly, his voice carrying the finality of absolute authority. "Garrett, you're relieved of duty, effective immediately. This woman is clearly innocent of any wrongdoing." But Jacob barely heard him. Anna's grip on his hand had gone slack, and her breathing was becoming more labored with each passing moment. The effort of speaking, of defending herself, had taken what little strength she had left. "Anna," he said urgently, dropping back into his chair beside her bed. "Anna, stay with me. Don't leave me now." She looked up at him with eyes that were growing dim, but her voice, when she spoke, was clear and strong. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. For caring, if I lived or died. For carrying me through the darkness. For giving me one last sunrise." "You're going to live," Jacob said fiercely, his voice breaking with emotion. "Do you hear me? You're going to live, and we're going to see 1,000 more sunrises together." Anna smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face despite the ravages of illness. "I know," she said softly, "because you gave me something to live for." And in that moment, Jacob Mueller realized that sometimes the greatest victories are not won through violence or force, but through the simple act of refusing to let hatred triumph over love, of choosing compassion over indifference, of carrying someone through their darkest hour toward the light of a new day. 6 months later, Jacob stood on the porch of the cabin he'd built on the mountainside overlooking the valley, watching Anna tend to her garden in the warm afternoon sunlight. The pneumonia had nearly killed her. For 3 days after the confrontation with Garrett, she had hovered between life and death, her fever raging despite everything Jacob could do. But she had fought her way back to health with a determination that amazed everyone who knew her. She was different now, stronger, more confident, as if surviving her ordeal had burned away the last of her fear and left behind only the essential core of who she was. The haunted look that had shadowed her eyes was gone, replaced by something that looked remarkably like peace. She had found her place in the world, and that place was here, with him, in the home they had built together. The mining camp had embraced them both with a warmth that still surprised Jacob. The miners treated Anna with genuine respect and affection, and she had become the unofficial healer for the camp, working alongside Jacob to treat injuries and illnesses. Her knowledge of traditional medicine complemented his formal training, and together they had saved lives that might otherwise have been lost. "Jacob," Anna called out, straightening up from the tomato plants she'd been tending. "Come see what's blooming." He walked down from the porch to where she knelt beside a patch of sunflowers that had grown taller than expected. The flowers were magnificent, their golden faces turned toward the sun with an almost religious devotion. "They're beautiful," he said, kneeling beside her in the rich earth they had cultivated together. "Like sunrise," she said, smiling up at him with eyes that sparkled with joy and contentment. Always reaching for the light, always growing toward something better. They had been married 3 months ago, a simple ceremony performed by Tom Brady in the camp's main hall. The miners had given them a wedding feast that lasted until dawn, and the celebration had been filled with laughter, music, and the kind of genuine happiness that comes from seeing two people who truly belong together. "I have something for you," Jacob said, pulling a small wrapped package from his pocket. It was their 6-month anniversary, 6 months since that terrible night when he had carried her through the snow, 6 months since they had found each other in the darkness. Anna opened the package carefully, revealing a delicate gold locket on a fine chain. Inside was a tiny painting, a sunrise over the mountains, painted by one of the miners who had been an artist before coming west to seek his fortune. "So you'll always remember," Jacob said softly, fastening the chain around her neck. "The sunrise that brought us together. The moment when everything changed." Anna's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the locket. "I remember everything," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "The snow, the cold, the fear. But most of all, I remember the moment when I realized I wasn't going to die alone. The moment when I knew that someone cared whether I lived or died." "I couldn't leave you," Jacob said, taking her hands in his. I couldn't then, and I couldn't now. You're part of me, Anna. You always will be. She reached up and touched his face, the same gentle touch she had given him that night in the snow when he thought they were both going to die. You carried me through the darkness, she said. And now we carry each other into the light. They stood together in the garden, surrounded by the flowers she had planted and the mountains they had claimed as home. In the distance, the mining camp was settling into its evening routine. The sound of men finishing their work, the smell of cooking fires, the normal sounds of life continuing its eternal rhythm. But here, in this moment, there was only the two of them and the sunset painting the peaks in shades of gold and crimson. Jacob looked down at his wife, this woman who had changed his life in ways he was still discovering, and felt a contentment deeper than anything he had ever known. The federal investigation into Garrett's actions had resulted in his dismissal from the Territorial Service and criminal charges for his attempts to murder both Anna and Jacob. The real cattle rustler, a woman named Sarah Crow Feather, had been captured 2 weeks after the incident, exactly matching the description Pete had given. Garrett was now serving time in the territorial prison, his hatred finally costing him everything he had claimed to protect. Anna had never spoken of revenge or justice. She seemed to view Garrett's downfall as simply the natural consequence of his choices, no more worth celebrating than the changing of the seasons. She had moved on, focusing her energy on building a life rather than dwelling on the past. One more sunrise, Jacob said softly, echoing the words that had sustained them through their darkest hour. Every day, Anna replied, her voice full of love and promise. Every day for the rest of our lives. The sun climbed higher, warming their faces and chasing away the last shadows of the night. Around them, the garden bloomed with the abundance of high summer, tomatoes heavy on the vine, corn reaching toward the sky, herbs releasing their fragrance into the warm air. It was a good life, Jacob reflected. Not the life he had planned or expected, but something far richer than anything he could have imagined. He had found love in the most unlikely place, with the most unlikely person, and it had transformed them both in ways that continued to surprise him. In the distance, a meadowlark sang its evening song, and the sound carried across the valley like a promise of hope fulfilled. The snow was gone, the danger was past, and love had indeed triumphed over hatred and fear. They had their sunrise, and all the ones that would follow. Together, they would face whatever storms might come, knowing that they had already survived the worst the world could throw at them. They had found each other in the darkness, and now they walked together in the light. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Jacob and Anna made their way back to the cabin, hand in hand, their hearts full of gratitude for the miracle of their survival and the gift of their love. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to make a difference in the world. But tonight, they were content simply to be together, to share the warmth of their home and the promise of all the tomorrows stretching out before them like an endless succession of sunrises, each one more beautiful than the last.